Good morning, everyone. We are continuing the Art of Supportive Leadership, our How to Work with People series. We're getting really close to the end, a few more days. Let's begin with a prayer. Heavenly Father, Divine Mother, friend, beloved God, Jesus Christ, Babaji Krishna, Lahiri Mahashaya, Swami Sri Yukteswar, beloved Master Paramhansa Yogananda, saints of all religions, dear friend Swami Kriyananda, humbly we bow to you all. Help us to feel your living presence, to act in everything we do from the inspiration, the inward rising inspiration of your loving presence, that spontaneously and naturally we will act in this world as instruments of your light, especially now as the Christmas season comes, the birth of Christ is celebrated. Help us to open ourselves to receive your light and to share that light with all. Om, peace. Amen. Today is Monday, which rhymes with money. So this is the day I remind you all that if you are finding benefit from any of the work that's coming through all these broadcasts, I invite you to help support it. Any donation of any amount is greatly appreciated. I have a site on Patreon, which is a wonderful website that connects people doing creative work with people who have resources to support them. And it's called Mission of the Masters. That's what I'm doing. Or you can type in Asha Nayaswami. You can go to my website, Asha Joy, and there's a way you can donate there, just if you prefer a one-time rather than a subscription. And the very nice news is I set up a nonprofit this year called Mission of the Masters. The IRS has recognized that it's a tax-exempt organization. So any of you who might be inclined to want to make a substantial before the end of the year donation for the benefit of your taxes, you can also find the information through any of those channels. Patreon is not the method to do that. You would have to do that directly to me through Mission of the Masters. And I'm just so overjoyed by the support so many of you are showing and the possibilities that it opens up for me to continue these broadcasts, to record some audiobooks. One of the books I've written was never made into an audiobook, Ask Asha, so we're going to be working on that. Your support has enabled us to see the translation and the design and now the publication of Light Bearer, the big book I wrote about Swami, coming out in Spanish and in Italian. Isn't that wonderful? So the light just keeps spreading, and we're sort of all in there together pushing it out. I think it's a worthy enterprise, and it's a great joy to share it with you. So now let's go to where we are in this book. We're in chapter, I think, 10, and it's called Leadership is Giving Support. So I read this paragraph at the end of the last session, but I want to tie it together with what comes after. A corollary rule, and one which I personally consider fundamental, although I doubt you'll find it in any other book on leadership, is this: accept only as much authority as people are willing to give you. Even then, handle it sensitively as a gift. There was a system of government in ancient India that has never been tried in the West. They had monarchies, of course, not democracies, and kings were traditionally the sons of the rulers before them, as they were in the West. Kings ruled, however, by permission of the people. It was understood that if the people no longer wanted them, they no longer had the right to rule. It seems to have been a good system, for it held ever before the king the truth that he was his people's servant, not their master by divine law, as Western kings claimed for themselves. Something of that system might be incorporated effectively into every organization where leadership is required. No, nothing in our present system supports anything like this. Even Swamiji's, as I started to say when I read the first paragraph in our last session, even Swamiji's attitude toward his leadership was very unusual, even in the context of that we were living in. It was that he wanted people. This is the context, and it's a bigger context than the corporate, but the same principles are true. Swami had absolute regard for people's free will, and he felt nothing good would ever come if that free will was impinged upon by an authority that he imposed that they did not invite. It's a short-term way to accomplish short-term goals, but it's not a long-term way to build trust and loyalty and creativity and effectiveness and life satisfaction. Now, of course, Swami's job was spiritual, period. Building Ananda, the only point of the whole organization he built was to help people spiritually. And the nature of self-realization is it cannot come from external influences. External influences can inspire you to to attune yourself, to direct your energy toward your goal. But self-realization, by its very definition, has to be your own spontaneous response to life. You can get all the soldiers in line, they can wear the right robes, they can say all the right prayers, they can have all the right gestures, and you can have a religious life. But self-realization, by definition, has to come from inside of you. And therefore, whatever influences you draw in, you get to decide, and you choose them because they are of benefit to you. Now, the authority of a spiritual figure like Swami Kriyananda, who acted in the name of Paramahansa Yogananda. Yogananda was the overarching guru, but Swami Kriyananda, as I always described it, that Yogananda was the king, but Swami was the prince, given responsibility for our particular little fiefdom here. And therefore, to honor the king, we had to honor the prince. It did not honor the king to say, I don't want to talk to the prince, I only want to talk to you. So Swami's position was very much in the guru lineage, even though he never took that title for himself, or through most of his life. Toward the end of his life, he accepted it, but for most of his life, he didn't. But he even kept all the accoutrements of leadership that he had every right to claim. He kept them all to the side, and he related to us, as he himself said, I always thought I could do more good for people as a simple, unaffected friend than in any other role. He said that in the same context, saying that Master had told him that Swami would have spiritual responsibility for people, that he wouldn't merely be a teacher in the sense of sharing the teaching, but that Swami himself would be responsible for our spiritual well-being. The nuances of that are beyond the subject that we're talking about today. But as a consequence, he was totally uninterested in authority for its own sake. He was only interested in helping people. And so, literally for many years, even the idea that he had such an influential role at Ananda was sort of not really talked about. But what happened was people began to understand from their own experience how extraordinarily beneficial it was to have a receptive relationship to Swamiji's consciousness. And as a result, the strength of our relationship to him for the core group of people who really understood it was simply unbreakable. Because it wasn't based on any form. It was based on our personal experience. Now Swami's elevating that same principle. You should never take more authority than people give you. And people should have the freedom to use their own experience and intuition as their criteria for how much authority you should have. A friend at Ananda who worked in a leadership position for a long time, he put it in a very colloquial way, because it took him a while to figure out what was going on. He said, when you do it Swamiji's way, it works out. And when you don't, it don't. And he was a very independent-minded man, but he just observed that there was enormous tangible benefit from paying attention to Swamiji's leadership role. And so we gave him authority because it was in our own best interest to do so, and I don't mean that coercively. It was in our personal best interest to be receptive to what he had to offer. And this was, let me think how to say that exactly. Well, in any case, so it's something to think about. If you have to impose your leader, if you have to insist that people must listen to you, perhaps you've already lost. And you need to ask yourself again, what am I not doing? Now, of course, there's always bad apples. There's always lemons. And it wasn't that Swami never stood up to defiance, because he was by no means weak. Anandamoy Ma, this wonderful woman saint in India that Swamiji was very close to for a long time when he lived in India, and many of us, I never met her in person, but her spirit has influenced my life a great deal. And I can't now, the exact wording of what she said, I don't quite remember, but she was talking about, because she was female and she had a very motherly, she was called Anandamoy Ma, joy-permeated mother. But she talked about cooperating and, not fighting and being in harmony. And then someone said to her, what if someone wants you to do something that's not dharmic, that's not honorable? She just smiled and said, let them try. Just like that. Because her willpower was there, but she exercised it with sensitivity. She won people rather than coerced them. And that was, of course, and in any organization, if you're loyal, if you're following the rest of the rules in this book, you see, then people will value you and be eager to solicit your input. I was starting to say there was always bad apples. This one man who was a bad apple, he wasn't a bad person, he was just a bad apple in the context. He was jealous and he wanted power for himself. And when Swami left the country for a few months, when he came back, this man had written a new constitution and had gathered a little group of people who were going, there were 3 areas of Ananda, and they were going to take possession of one of them. And their entire constitution was, Swami Kriyananda shall have no input. That was basically their only rule. And this man presented this to Swamiji with a couple of other people who were there with him. And Swamiji just, let him make the presentation. And then he said to this man, first he said, I did not found Ananda to turn it over to you. It's like, what are you thinking? I'm just going to walk away? I did not found Ananda to turn it over to you. That was the first thing he said. The second thing he said was, I give you 6 months, 3 months to default on the mortgage and 3 months for them to foreclose, and then the whole thing is lost. He said, all the money to support this area of Ananda comes from the other areas of Ananda. There's no self-generated energy from here. It's carried by those who are following Swamiji, in fact. We're carrying this. If I stepped out of it, it will collapse in 6 months. And he just said, firmly though, no. Just no. And then the whole thing collapsed, and the bad apple and his cronies just went somewhere else, left to do something else. So it's not like there's never a moment, but also it's important. And there was another incident like that in the early 70s. This was the early 70s too. But where Swamiji actually made a confrontation, and actually that comes later in this book too, confronted, very strongly confronted, and did lay out that we're going to do it the way I've said to do it. And you need to listen to me in this circumstance. But later Swami said he knew that the greater majority of people, and all the people with real energy, wanted Swamiji's leadership. They had accepted it. And it was just a minority that was just constantly resisting. And he knew he had, oh, have we have a problem? Is that what you want? He knew that he had the support to take that stand. So it's not like, again, that you never stand up. You have to realize that common sense has to be part of this thinking. And so you win the majority of people. This is what they want. You don't have to tolerate and baby the complainers or those who are just out of tune and don't belong with you. Don't be afraid to take a stand and then let the chips fall where they may, but be sure you have strength before you do it. In that first confrontation it was 1971, actually, it was that early. It had to do with the building of a building at the farm, at the village property. And what Swami actually said at that meeting was, I rarely speak up as strongly as I'm speaking now, but when I do, I expect to be listened to. And if you're not going to listen to me, then I'll just leave. And I had just arrived like 6 months earlier, and all of a sudden I hear Swami say he's about to leave. And then the meeting just went on, and the complainers just started complaining about what he was doing and all the reasons why it was the wrong decision and so on. And I panicked. This is how I remember it. Maybe memory serves me improperly, but I panicked and sort of cried out in a voice that I was about 3 octaves higher than my normal, which is not that low anyway. Didn't you hear him? He says he's going to leave. And I was just so panicked about it. And then that sort of caused the people who were in support of Swami to start speaking, or maybe it was just the timing of the moment, I don't know. But then Swami's supporters started speaking. And in the end, like 30 or 40 people actually left Ananda community at that point, but they were not in tune with what was happening. That was just like, we had to gather enough people to get started, and then it clarified itself. But later when I talked to Swami, I was just like, how could you do that? And he just said, Asha, I knew for sure that I had a majority. I knew that the community wanted me to take a stand. You see, he was taking as much authority as his people were giving him, but not everybody resident on the property was really with Swamiji. But the majority were. He said, if I hadn't had that confidence, he said, I never would have called that meeting. He wouldn't have called it just to see if he had support. He only called it because he knew he had support. But then he didn't hesitate. So that's sort of, putting this in the right way. You have to serve the ideal of what you're trying to serve. You have to serve the people who understand what your project is, not everybody who happens to come in the door. So he says, a good leader is also willing to do the lowest and most difficult task. He should never assign jobs to others that he would not be willing to perform himself. Always he should feel that it is his place to serve others. This can't be overemphasized. The boss that just sails in and thinks that his job is to keep his hands clean and to wear the most expensive clothes, he can arouse envy, but he won't arouse loyalty. But if you're right in there staying up all night making it happen when it has to happen, that's what really tells people who you really are as a person and gives them trust. It also makes them feel that you respect what they're doing, because otherwise it's, oh, we'll just let that person do this unpleasant job. I'm just going to go to tea with my cronies. Again, these all have to be done with common sense, but there has to be that feeling which from time to time has to be demonstrated, that I'm just going to be here and do it. I remember when we were first starting this community here, and we were doing one of our first Christmas seasons, and there was a tremendous amount of work involved, and planning, and I was in the role that I am now, which is I was leading many of the events and, the primary speaker and planner and all these things. And I remember it was Christmas Eve, and it was just like I was really tired, and I just lay down on the bed. I was just going to take a short nap. But just as my head hit the pillow, I started thinking about, like, 3 hours from now, there was going to be an event, and I think we were in the community then, somewhere in this room, and I just realized that there was no plan to set up that room. It somehow it had slipped. Just got right up and went over and vacuumed and washed and set the tables, and I didn't mind at all, but it was just like, it has to be done. And so I do it. For many years, because I was always in the leadership position, I would try to find the times when I was able to help. So I made it a habit to, like, on the last Christmas event, I couldn't stay after Christmas Eve because I had to be back on Christmas morning, and I had to be realistic about my sleep. But after the last Christmas event, I was done. And so I would always make a habit of just staying and, cleaning up with everyone. It was fun, for one thing. It was just marvelously fun to do. But as a leader, always be thinking about that. Sometimes the unique requirements of your position prevent you from doing anything else. But don't let it become a habit that you never do anything else, because then this separation develops between you and the people you're serving. And a lot of, friendship happens when you're all just taking out the trash together and mopping the floor, and can just reminisce about whatever wonderful thing just happened. So all of this is important. And sometimes you just do things so that people can laugh. I remember a friend liked to do skits, and he really liked the Star Trek skits. Star Trek is the one where you wear the little skinny suits, I think, and you have the button here. I get a little confused, and also my cultural references are out of date. So he did a Star Trek skit, and he asked me to be in it. And somebody gave us the costumes, the little skinny costumes, and the whole thing. And I don't to this day know exactly why, but he kept it a secret that I was in it. I mean, normally I'm standing up there in my white robes, being the light bearer, doing all these things. But all of a sudden, in the middle of the skit, I walk out in this little onesie, this little spandex onesie, and everybody started laughing. And they just found it so funny to see me standing there in that little costume giving these little lines. I couldn't give any lines for a long time because they were just laughing. And they weren't laughing with me, they were actually laughing at me. And it was also, besides the fact that the response was so interesting, it was also marvelous for me, because you get in the habit, people treat you in a certain way, and all of a sudden they found me completely ludicrous. And it was great for me too to just stand there and just, not flinch. Just let them laugh at me in my little Star Trek onesie. And it was, it makes me laugh now. It was just great. It was just, we're all in this together, friends. And we don't have to have all this hierarchy. We may have different responsibilities, but anything you do, I'll do it. Why would I not? And sometimes leaders make an exaggerated case for doing that, and I think it's better to make an exaggerated case than not to remember. But the best of all is to just ask yourself, when help is needed, can I help? And if help is needed and I can help, sometimes I notice in our Sangha, sometimes the trash cans don't get emptied because it's not specifically somebody's job. Of course, I say to myself, well, empty them, Like, there's two things you can do. One is you can say, well, the trash cans weren't emptied. And the other is you can just empty the trash cans. Like, why not? That's what you have to ask yourself. Why would I not do this? And if it's self-concept, or you don't want people to see you that way, it's a very good question. Ask yourself, why would I not do this? If others can do it, why would I not do it? And it's a mindset. This is where Swami's comment, to be a simple, unaffected friend to people. That's the best kind of leader. The last point that Swami makes in this chapter, finally, the leader should always look ahead to the time when he will have to step aside and allow others to take charge. As all life is said to be a preparation for the final examination of death, so all leadership should be viewed as a preparation for the moment when one passes the reins on to his successor. On how well your organization functions after you leave it, quite as much as how well it is functioning now, can your true skill as a leader be judged. It is a sad fact that organizations rarely continue to flourish after their founder's passing. And it's very interesting. Swami Kriyananda started Ananda, in the mid-60s, got the property in 1968, the first property. He passed away in 2013, by which point Ananda was established in Europe and in India and many places in the United States. And we had friends and members in dozens of countries. And Swami passed in 2013. He was 86. His health had been poor for a long time. We all knew that he could have died at any moment. So even though he died suddenly, in the sense that he was sitting down waiting for his breakfast, he had a seizure, and 15 minutes later he was gone. So it wasn't an instantaneous death, but there was no build-up to it. There was no opportunity for us to know. I got a phone call that Swami was having trouble breathing, and seems to me like within 5 minutes, I got a call that he was dead, that he had passed away. Ananda continued seamlessly. And by Swamiji's criteria, it's really, really interesting how Ananda just has continued. Now, of course, the absence of Swami is an infinite absence. But the presence of Swami is also an infinite presence, just not, you can't write him an email and you can't talk to him on the phone. It's taken me years to realize he was not going to walk back in the door because he lived on 3 continents, but every so often he would pass through. So there would be long absences and then there would be presence. And now, after 6, 7 years, 8 years, I'm getting used to the fact that he's not likely to walk in the door again. But he did everything that he's describing in this leadership book. You know, this book is a handbook written by a practitioner. This book is not like nice theories about how leadership might work. This is, how is it done? And when he says always thinking about the future, Swamiji's style of leadership was to give individuals as much responsibility as they were willing to take. And the limitation of how much responsibility he would pass on to you was entirely a question of how much you were willing to carry. There was never in his reality a need or a desire to hold it. So when he wasn't there physically anymore, for many years, all of us who he had poured so much energy into for so many years, we were just operating. And we were already operating with intuitive attunement. Intuitive attunement not just to Swamiji, but to the flow of grace that came through him. So even though he was the opening, and I always pray to Swamiji, and he's just, I can't separate my own life from his. There is no separation. But who he was and what we were attuning to was the flow of grace that came through him. So therefore, that flow of grace still comes through him. It wasn't his physical presence that we were attuned to. It was the flow of grace that came through his consciousness. And even when he was in his physical body, even when he was sitting in the room with you, what you had to be attuned to was the vibration of consciousness that was coming through. And that vibration of consciousness is universal. And the forward movement of Ananda, and I'll say a little bit more about this tomorrow, after Swami's passing, was precisely what he said here. The greatness of his leadership has been demonstrated by what happened after he wasn't here physically anymore. Fascinating. And it takes the whole subject of leadership and just elevates it to an entirely new level, which is Dwapara Yuga leadership for a higher age. And that's what we're really working for here. God bless you, my friends.